The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Margaret Ellis would later decide was the cruelest detail of all, because Tuesday had always felt like a safe kind of day. She was holding Clara on her hip, the baby's weight familiar and warm against her side, when the stagecoach driver dropped the folded paper into her free hand without a word. Around her, the town of Copper Creek baked under an Arizona sun so flat and merciless it felt personal. The main street was a single strip of weathered storefronts and hard-packed dirt, and every person standing on it had turned to look at her. The strange woman who had stepped off the stage with a carpet bag, a baby, and an expression that said she was expecting someone to be waiting. No one was waiting. The paper in her hand was not a note from Peter. It was a bill of sale. His signature was at the bottom, dated 6 weeks prior. The land, the livestock, the ranch house, the well. All of it sold to a man named Caleb Thornton for 40 cents on the dollar. Peter Anderson had been gone for 6 weeks, and Margaret Ellis had traveled 900 miles to reach a life that no longer existed. She did not cry. That was the first thing people in Copper Creek noticed about her, and they took it as evidence of something wrong with her character, rather than proof of how thoroughly she had already been broken before she arrived. She stood in the street holding the bill of sale and the baby, and she did not cry, because she had learned, the hard way, over a long time, that crying in front of strangers only gave them something to talk about later. Clara, at 6 months old, had no such restraint. She started fussing almost immediately, the kind of low, escalating sound that meant hunger, and Margaret shifted her to the other hip and looked down the street, as if somewhere in this baked-out little town there was an answer that made sense. There wasn't. The story of how she had gotten here was not a complicated one, though it felt complicated when she tried to think about it. Her sister Ruth had died of fever the previous winter, leaving Clara without parents and Margaret without the only family she had. Margaret was 31 years old, unmarried, working as a seamstress in a crowded Missouri town where she paid more in rent than she earned in wages, and where no one was going to come looking for her if she disappeared. When the letter arrived from Peter Anderson, responding to her correspondence in a frontier newspaper, earnest and direct and full of specific plans, she had let herself believe it. That was the mistake, she supposed, letting herself believe something because she needed it to be true. She had believed in the ranch. She had believed in the husband. She had believed, most desperately, in the idea that Clara deserved better than a cold room above a tailor's shop and a future that started and ended with other people's mending. The bill of sale in her hand disagreed with all of that. "You the mail-order bride?" The voice came from the doorway of the mercantile, a heavy-set woman in a flour-dusted apron with the kind of expression that said she had formed her opinion before asking the question. "I was supposed to be," Margaret said. The woman, her name was Dora Kinsey, as Margaret would learn, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Anderson's gone. Sold out to Thornton 6 weeks ago and cleared town before the ink was dry. You're not the first woman he pulled that scheme on, I'll tell you that much." She looked at Clara. "Whose baby is that?" "My niece. Her mother passed." "And you brought her out here?" It wasn't a question. It had the shape of a verdict. "I brought her somewhere better than where we were." Margaret heard the thinness in her own voice and hated it. "I didn't know things had changed." "Things change fast out here," Dora said, and went back inside without offering anything else. Not a chair, not a glass of water, not a single human word of what might come next. Margaret stood in the street holding Clara and the useless bill of sale and tried to count what she had. $12.40 in her bag. A change of clothes for herself. 3 changes of clothes for Clara, who was already soaking through one of them. A bone-handled sewing kit that had belonged to her mother. Half a loaf of bread that had gone stale 2 days before. $12. No roof. No husband. No plan. The sun was past noon and coming down like judgment. She found the rooming house on the strength of a handwritten sign nailed to a door at the end of the block, but Mrs. Alderman, the proprietor, looked at the baby and then looked at Margaret's bag and asked for $3 up front before she would show her a room. I'm waiting for arrangements to be made," Margaret said, which was not exactly a lie, but was not close to the truth either. $3, Mrs. Alderman said. "For 2 nights. After that we renegotiate." It was too much. Margaret knew it was too much, and she paid it anyway because Clara was starting to shake with hunger, and the room was the only option that had a door that closed. She sat on the narrow bed and fed Clara from the tin of prepared formula she'd carried all the way from Missouri, almost gone now, 2 days left if she stretched it, and tried to think clearly about a situation that did not reward clear thinking. She had $9.40. She was in a town where no one knew her except as the woman who had been foolish enough to travel 900 miles for a man who had already left. She had a baby who needed milk and shade, and eventually something that counted as a home. None of those three facts connected in a way that produced an answer. She had not slept properly in 4 days. Her back ached from the stagecoach. Her eyes felt sandy and wrong. Clara finally fell asleep against her chest, and Margaret stayed completely still for 45 minutes, afraid that moving would wake her, staring at the ceiling of a rented room in a town she had never meant to stay in. At some point, she couldn't say exactly when, she stopped being afraid and became angry instead. It was a cleaner feeling. Anger had edges you could hold on to. Peter Anderson had done this to them, had sat down with paper and pen and written her a future that he was simultaneously dismantling, had signed over the land, pocketed the money, and vanished, and had at no point in that process thought about the woman and child who were traveling toward the life he was erasing. She hoped, for one sharp moment, that his horse threw him somewhere very far from water. Then she hoped something worse, and felt no guilt about it at all. By the second morning, the story had moved through Copper Creek, the way stories always moved in small places, fast and wrong at the edges. What Margaret overheard, as she carried Clara to the mercantile to price infant formula, was a version of herself she barely recognized. In this version, she was a schemer, a woman who had latched onto Anderson's advertisement, knowing full well that frontier men were lonely and distracted and easier to fool than men back east. Some people had her arriving pregnant by a different man and using Anderson as a solution. One version, whispered loudly enough that she was clearly meant to hear, had her abandoning a husband of her own back in Missouri. She bought the formula without looking at anyone directly and paid 30 cents she couldn't afford and walked back through the heat telling herself it didn't matter what they thought. It mattered. That was the thing about needing something from people. You couldn't make their opinions irrelevant just by deciding to. She needed work. She would ask Dora Kinsey about work because Dora Kinsey was unpleasant in an honest way, and Margaret had always found that easier to negotiate with than people who hid it. She would offer seamstress work, alterations, anything that produced income, and she would not think past the next 2 weeks because 2 weeks was as far as she could see, and trying to see further only produced panic. She was crossing the main street, Clara on her hip, formula under her arm, when the three men stepped out of the saloon. Check. They were not remarkable-looking men. That was the worst part of it, Margaret would think later. They looked like anyone. Dusty shirts, worn boots, the kind of sunburned idleness that meant they hadn't been working that day, and probably hadn't been working the day before either. The one in front was taller than the other two, with a thin mouth that smiled when there was nothing to smile about. "There she is," he said, "the abandoned bride." It was the word abandoned that she hated most, not because it wasn't accurate, because of the way he said it, like it was something she had earned. "Excuse me," she said, and tried to walk around him. He stepped sideways. Nothing dramatic, just a shift of weight, but it blocked her path as clearly as a wall. "Where are you headed? Not like you got anywhere to be." He looked at Clara. "She yours?" "I need to get past, please." "Peter Anderson's girl." He said it to the other two like she wasn't there. "You hear he left her money to take care of the baby? That's what I heard. Just not enough to pay the rooming house, so she's shopping around for the next arrangement." The other two men laughed. One of them was looking at her in a way that made the back of her neck go cold. "I don't know who you are," Margaret said, keeping her voice level with an effort that cost her. "And I don't particularly want to. I'm going to walk past you now." "You're going to—" he started and then stopped. Not because of anything she did, because of a voice from behind her. "Jim." One word, not loud. The kind of voice that didn't need to be loud because something in it settled the air around it. She turned. The man standing 10 feet away was not large in the way that made people step back automatically, but there was something in how he stood, still in a way that wasn't passive, like a thing that had decided not to move and meant it, that made the three men in front of her suddenly look smaller. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that said working ranch rather than anything more or less than that. His eyes were a color she couldn't name at that distance. He was looking at Jim with an expression that did not appear angry at all, which she would later understand was the more dangerous version. "You know me," the man said, "and you know what I think about this kind of thing." Jim's thin mouth lost its smile for a moment. "Just talking, Ethan." "Then talk to someone else." A long pause. The kind where Jim was deciding whether this situation was worth whatever would come after it. And then he stepped back and his two companions stepped back with him, and the three of them drifted back toward the saloon with the deliberate casualness of men pretending they'd been about to leave anyway. The man named Ethan looked at her. "You all right?" "Yes," she said, which was close to true if you didn't look too carefully at how hard she was gripping Clara. "Walker," he said. "Ethan Walker. I have a ranch about 4 miles north." "Margaret Ellis." She shifted Clara to her other arm. I was supposed to marry Peter Anderson." "I know." He said it without any of the inflection she'd been collecting all morning. No judgment stacked behind it, just information he had received. "Where are you staying?" "Mrs. Alderman's. For now." He nodded slowly. She couldn't tell what he was calculating. "How much money do you have?" It was a rude question. She answered it anyway because lying felt like an additional weight she couldn't carry right now. $9, roughly. Something moved behind his eyes. "That's not going to get you far out here." "No," she said. "I'm aware of that." He looked at Clara again, and she watched his face do something she hadn't expected. A kind of plain, uncomplicated concern, the sort that didn't try to dress itself up as anything else. "I have a spare room," he said. "It's not much. Used to be a storage room, but there's a window and a proper floor. You could use it while you figure out what's next. No charge. My housekeeper left 3 months ago, and the place has gone sideways without her. You'd be doing me a favor by being there, if you want to look at it that way." Margaret stared at him. She had learned in 31 years to be careful about offers that arrived too easily. She had learned it from watching her mother. She had learned it from her own earlier choices in matters of the heart. She had learned it, most recently and most vividly, from a man named Peter Anderson, who had written her a beautiful letter from a life he was already abandoning. "Why?" she said. Ethan Walker looked slightly caught, like the question was fair and he hadn't quite prepared an answer for it. "Because you've got a baby and $9 and Jim Harker was about to make your day considerably worse," he finally said. "And because I'd want someone to do the same if it was me." It was not a polished answer. That was, she decided, the reason she believed it. She said she'd think about it and spent 2 hours in Mrs. Alderman's room trying to make $9 stretch into something resembling a plan. By the end of those 2 hours, she had a list of what was impossible, which was most things, and a list of what was barely possible, which was shorter and less inspiring. She thought about what Ruth would say. Ruth had always been the practical one, the one who believed in numbers and contingencies and having a second plan before you'd fully committed to the first. Ruth would look at the numbers and say, "Take the room, Maggie, and figure out the rest later." She went back to the mercantile and asked Dora Kinsey, who was unpleasant but knew everything, what she knew about Ethan Walker. Dora Kinsey looked at her for a long moment. "You asking if he's decent?" "I'm asking what kind of man he is." "Came out here 8 years ago from Texas," Dora said, folding a piece of muslin with the deliberate precision of someone who thought while their hands worked. "Built that ranch himself, mostly. Keeps to himself, pays his debts, doesn't drink that I've ever seen, which out here is either a virtue or a character flaw, depending on who you ask." She set down the muslin. "He ever do anything bad that got back to me?" "No." "He ever do anything showy that got back to me?" "Also no. That's about as much as I can tell you." Is there a wife?" "Was. She died in childbirth 2 years after he arrived. The baby didn't make it either." Dora's voice was neutral, reporting, not embellishing. "He's been alone since." Margaret stood there and let that information settle. It didn't make him less of a stranger. It didn't make his offer less dangerous. But it made him feel real. The way grief made people real, when you let it. "Thank you," she said. She went back to Mrs. Alderman's, collected her bag and her daughter and her remaining $7, and walked 4 miles north in the heat of an Arizona afternoon toward a ranch she had never seen and a life she had not planned. The ranch was not beautiful. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. because she had spent enough of this year imagining things into being better than they were. It was functional and tired in the way of places that had been worked hard without enough hands to maintain them. The fence along the road needed mending. The yard between the house and the barn held the equipment of a working operation: tools, rope, a wagon with one wheel temporarily propped. But it had the feeling of things put down in the middle of a task and not yet picked back up. The house itself was solidly built. She noticed that first. It had been put together by someone who understood what winter wind could do and what summer heat could do, and had made choices accordingly. The walls were thick. The windows were well set. It had the bones of a place that was meant to last. Ethan met her in the yard. He looked, she thought, slightly surprised that she'd actually come, which meant he had not been entirely certain she would, which meant his offer had been genuine rather than calculated. That told her something. "I'll show you the room," he said, and took her bag without asking. It was, as he'd said, a converted storage room, small, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that faced east. Not comfortable, but clean, which told her something else about him. He had prepared it before she arrived, had decided to keep the offer open even when he wasn't sure she'd take it, and had taken the time to make it decent. "There's no crib," he said, looking at Clara with an expression that bordered on helpless. I'll get something figured out." "A drawer works," Margaret said. "A deep one, lined with something soft. She won't know the difference." He looked at her for a moment. "A drawer. She's 6 months old. She's not picky." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was related to one. "Dinner's at 6, he said. "If you want it. You don't have to eat with me. I can leave a plate." "I'll eat with you," she said. It would be strange not to. She could see him deciding whether strange was the right word. She could see him deciding not to debate it. 6 o'clock, he said, and left her to settle in. What? Dinner was beans and salt pork and biscuits that were good enough that she asked, and he said he'd learned from necessity, and necessity was a better teacher than he'd expected. She told him about Missouri and about the seamstress work, and about Ruth, because it seemed like information he should have if he was letting her sleep in his house. He told her about the ranch, the cattle he was running, the land dispute with a neighboring property, a water rights problem that had been going on since before she arrived and would probably outlast her stay. He did not talk about his wife. She did not ask. Clara sat on a folded blanket on the floor beside the table and watched the lantern flame with the absolute focused intensity that babies brought to light, and Ethan glanced at her twice without seeming to realize he was doing it. "What will you do?" he asked at the end of the meal. "After you figure out the immediate situation." "I don't know," she said honestly. "Sewing, if anyone will hire me. I'm good with alterations, better with tailoring. If I can save enough, maybe I can—" She stopped. She didn't know what came after. Maybe I can, because she hadn't let herself think that far. "I'll figure it out when I know what there is to figure out." He nodded like that was a reasonable position. She appreciated it. A lot of people would have offered her opinions about what she ought to do, and she was tired of other people's opinions about her situation. "I pay fair wages," he said, not quite casually. "If you wanted to do some work around here while you're sorting things, cooking, mending, whatever needs doing, I'm not trying to take advantage of your situation. It would just be work, and you'd be paid for it." She looked at him across the table. "You're very straightforward," she said. "Easier that way," he said. "People spend a lot of time on everything except what they mean. Doesn't seem worth it." She thought about Peter Anderson's letter, the care in every sentence, the pictures painted of a future that didn't exist, the time he must have spent on everything except what he actually meant. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." No. She worked. That was what saved her, she thought. Not him, not the roof, not any one thing, but the working. She rose before Ethan did, which surprised him the first morning enough that he stopped in the kitchen doorway and stared, and she had already made coffee and was feeding Clara and had noted 3 things in the house that needed mending. She was not there to be grateful. She had decided that early. Grateful was a position that put you below someone, and she had spent too long below someone already. She was there because it was the practical decision, and she intended to be useful enough to justify it, and she would feel nothing in particular about it except the steady satisfaction of a deal being honored. That was what she told herself. The truth was more complicated, but she wasn't ready for the truth to be complicated yet. She asked about the land dispute on the 4th day, Because Ethan came in from a fence-mending job with a look she'd started to recognize, tight around the eyes, mouth set slightly wrong. That meant something had happened, and he wasn't sure how to talk about it. "Thornton," he said, pouring water into the basin to wash his hands. "Caleb Thornton. He owns about a third of this valley. He wants the other two-thirds, including this, especially this." He dried his hands without looking at her. "The water comes down from the north ridge through my property. Whoever controls this land controls the water for everything downstream. Thornton knows that. He's been offering to buy me out for 2 years. And you've said no. It's my father's land." He said it flatly, like it was the end of a sentence and also the beginning and middle of every sentence about this subject. "What does he do when you say no?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Things," he said. "Fences cut, cattle moved. A fire last spring that I couldn't prove was anything but accident." He looked at her then. "He sent men last week. To talk, they said. They weren't there to talk." Margaret thought about the bill of sale with Peter Anderson's signature, about 40 cents on the dollar. "Peter Anderson sold to Thornton," she said. "That land you told me about, on the east side." "Yes." "How did Anderson afford land here in the first place?" "He didn't, particularly." Ethan set down the cloth. "Thornton set him up, gave him the land cheap to use as a front, then squeezed him out when he needed it. Same trick he's used on 4 other families in this valley." He paused. "Anderson didn't have the nerve for it when the pressure came. Took what Thornton offered and ran." She let that sit for a moment. "So Thornton is the one who destroyed what Anderson promised me." "Thornton destroys a lot of," Ethan said quietly. "He's been doing it long enough that people have started to think it's just how things are." Clara made a sound from the other room, the particular note that meant she was about to escalate from commentary to complaint, and Margaret went to her, and Ethan was left in the kitchen in the particular silence of a man with a fight coming that he wasn't sure how to win. She heard it. She was listening by then. 3 weeks in, she stopped counting the days. That was how she knew something had shifted. Not that it had become comfortable exactly, but that it had stopped feeling temporary in the way that demands constant attention. Clara had taken to watching Ethan with the same focused intensity she brought to the lantern flame, and Ethan had, gradually, helplessly, in the way of a man who has no defenses against a creature that small being that interested in him, begun talking to her. Not baby talk. He apparently didn't know baby talk. He talked to her the way he talked to anyone, except quieter and more careful, explaining what he was doing and why, as if she was capable of forming an opinion and he wanted her informed. Margaret watched this from a careful distance and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the particular warmth of watching a person be better than they knew they were. She was doing the mending one evening, a pile of his work shirts that had been accumulating since the housekeeper left, when she found the photograph. It had fallen between the folded shirts, small and creased from being held too many times. A young woman, dark-haired, with a smile that suggested she found something genuinely funny about having her photograph taken. Margaret looked at it for a moment. Then she set it on the table where he'd find it, and went back to the mending, and didn't say anything about it. He came in an hour later and saw it, and went still. "I found it in the shirts," she said, without looking up. "Figured it shouldn't get lost." "Thank you," he said, in a voice she didn't ask about. He put the photograph somewhere more careful. He sat down across the table and watched her work in silence for a while, and she let him, because some silences are not empty. "Her name was Anna," he said eventually. "She looked like someone who laughed a lot," Margaret said. "She did." He was quiet for a moment. "You get used to quiet. It just takes longer than people say it does." Margaret thought about Ruth, about the specific silence of a house that used to have another person in it. "Yes," she said. "It does." Nothing else. But something in the room changed, or maybe something between them changed, and they both knew it, and neither of them mentioned it, because some things need a lot more time before they can be mentioned. Outside, the Arizona night came down over the valley, and somewhere to the south, in an office in Copper Creek, Caleb Thornton was making plans that neither of them knew about yet. But that was coming. The way trouble always came in country like this, quiet at first, so quiet you almost missed it, until the day it arrived at your door and was impossible to ignore. Margaret Ellis had been running from trouble her whole life, or trying to, or pretending she wasn't doing either. She was 31 years old, and she had $9 to her name when she stepped off a stagecoach into a life that had already been erased. She did not know yet that the life she was building in its place was going to be harder to take from her. She did not know yet that she was the kind of woman it was very difficult to erase. She was starting to suspect it. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday morning in the shape of a man on a gray horse. Margaret was in the yard hanging laundry when she heard the hoofbeats, and she had been out here long enough now, 5 weeks, which still surprised her when she counted it, that she had learned to read the difference between someone coming with ordinary business and someone coming with a purpose that hadn't been announced. This horse moved with the particular deliberate pace of something being controlled, not ridden. She didn't stop what she was doing. She kept her hands on the wet shirt she was pinning and watched from the corner of her eye. The man who dismounted was somewhere around 50, with the kind of build that said he had once been physical and had since decided other people could be physical on his behalf. He was dressed better than anyone Margaret had seen in Copper Creek. Not flashy, but carefully, the way men dressed when they wanted you to understand that money was not something they thought about because they didn't have to. His boots were clean, which out here meant someone cleaned them for him. Ethan came out of the barn. He had heard the hoofbeats too. "Thornton," he said. Not a greeting. An acknowledgement, like identifying a weather pattern. "Walker." Caleb Thornton looked around the yard with the slow appraisal of a man who is calculating value. His eyes moved to the laundry line, to Clara in her basket near the porch steps, to Margaret. He let his gaze rest on her a beat longer than necessary. "Didn't know you had company." "She's not company," Ethan said. "What do you need?" "Just a conversation." Thornton smiled with the lower half of his face. "I wanted to come myself this time, instead of sending men. More respectful that way. I think you'll agree." "You can say what you came to say." Thornton turned to look at the North Ridge, at the line of cottonwoods that marked where the creek ran down through Ethan's property. "Water table's dropping this year," he said conversationally. "Ranchers downstream are going to feel it by August. People are worried." "People can come talk to me about the water themselves," Ethan said. "Some of them have." Thornton turned back, and now the smile was slightly different, patient in a way that was not kind. "They're not worried about access, Ethan. They're worried about what happens to access when a single rancher decides to put his interests first. Water law in this territory is complicated, takes money to navigate. More money than most of the families around here have." It was smooth. Margaret heard the shape of it clearly. The threat wrapped so carefully in concern that you had to hold it up to the light at a certain angle to see what it actually was. She wondered how many times he'd delivered a version of this speech, and how many men had heard only the concern and missed the threat. "My interests and the downstream ranchers' interests are the same," Ethan said. "They have been for 8 years. You know that." "What I know," Thornton said, "is that your interests might change. Life changes, Walker. Circumstances change." He glanced at Margaret again, brief and pointed. "My offer stands. Full market value, better than you'd get from anyone else. You could start somewhere else. Somewhere without all this." A small pause. "Complication." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "No." Thornton nodded slowly, like this was the answer he'd expected and had already planned around. "Think on it," he said, which was not the same as accepting the refusal. He mounted the gray horse and looked down from the added height with the particular expression of a man who believes that time, at least, is on his side. "I'll be back when you've had more time to consider." He rode south without hurrying. Ethan stood in the yard until the horse was out of sight. Margaret unpinned the shirt she'd already pinned. She'd done it wrong, too tight, she hadn't been paying enough attention, and did it again properly. "How long has he been doing this?" she asked. 2 years of offers, Ethan said. Before that, 2 years of smaller things. He builds gradually. Offers first, then inconveniences, then things that can't be proven. The fire. The fire was the third fence. I had stopped counting by then. He picked up a bucket near the porch steps and turned it in his hands without any evident purpose. "He bought out Anderson's land last month. That puts him on my eastern boundary. He already owns the land to the south. I've got neighbors to the north and west, the Harmon family, and the Delacroix claim, but Thornton's been working on them too." "What does he do when the offers don't work?" Ethan set down the bucket. "You just watched him do part of it," he said. "He plants doubt. Gets people uncertain about the future so they start to think selling is safety instead of surrender. Margaret thought about Peter Anderson, about a man who had built something and then, when the pressure came, had taken 40 cents on the dollar and run. She thought about how easy it must be to look like survival when you were actually just giving up. He looked at me, she said. Ethan turned. What? He looked at me like I was information. She met his eyes. He knows who I am, or enough about me. He was calculating what that adds to his picture. Ethan was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding not to tell her she was overthinking it, because he'd had the same thought. Yeah, he said finally. He was. That afternoon, she went into Copper Creek for flour and thread, and she felt the shift in the town before anyone said a word. It was in how the women at the dry goods store moved slightly away when she came in, and in how Dora Kinsey's greeting had a new quality to it. Not less friendly exactly, but more measured, like she was choosing what to give and what to hold back. It was in how a man outside the hardware store said something to his companion that stopped when she walked past. The way conversations stop when you are the subject of them. She bought her flour. She bought her thread. She kept her expression neutral the way she'd learned to do in Missouri when the neighbors were deciding what to think of a seamstress who lived alone. On her way back to the wagon, she passed Jim Harker, the thin-mouthed man from her first day in town. He was leaning against the post outside the saloon with his two companions, and he watched her load the flour with a particular quality of attention that she had learned to identify as threat-checking. He was seeing if she'd look at him, seeing if she'd flinch. She did neither. She lifted the flour herself, which was heavy, and stored it behind the seat, and picked up the reins and drove out of Copper Creek without once acknowledging that Jim Harker existed. Her hands were steady on the reins. That was what she told herself mattered. In her chest, something was tightening that she couldn't name yet. She told Ethan about the shift in town over dinner because he had been the one to tell her plainly that Thornton worked by eroding support, and she thought he should know the erosion had started. He listened with the particular stillness he had when something confirmed what he'd feared. He'll be talking to people, he said, not saying anything specific, just asking questions, wondering aloud. About me. About you being here. About what that means about me. Whether I'm thinking clearly. He pushed the food around his plate. People in this valley have reason to be nervous about Thornton. If he can make them nervous about me too, they've got nowhere to land. He wants them isolated, she said, each family alone. That's how he's done it everywhere else. He set down his fork. I've been trying to get the neighboring families to meet together, talk, figure out a common position, but it's hard to get people to sit in the same room when they're already halfway too afraid. Margaret thought about the feeling in the dry goods store, about how quickly people moved away from something uncertain, how instinctive that movement was, how you couldn't really blame them for it, even when it left you standing alone. People don't need much of a reason to choose the safer-looking side, she said, even when it's not actually safer. No, he said, they don't. Clara was fussing in the other room. Margaret went to her, and when she came back, Ethan was standing at the window with his coffee, looking out at the dark yard, and she thought he had the look of someone adding numbers that weren't adding up. The Harmon family, she said, and the Delacroix claim. How well do you know them? Harmons are good people. George Harmon's a practical man, not easy to push. His wife Eleanor is sharper than anyone gives her credit for. He turned from the window. Delacroix. Henri Delacroix. He's alone out there since his son went east last year. He's the one Thornton's been working hardest. I can see it in him every time I run into him. That look of a man who's starting to believe the ground under him isn't solid. Then that's where you need to start, she said. Not with the people who are already certain, with Delacroix. He looked at her for a moment. That's what I've been thinking. Then do it soon, she said, before Thornton gets there first. The next morning, Ethan rode to the Delacroix claim. He'd been thinking about making this visit for 3 weeks and had kept finding reasons to postpone it, which he recognized as his own brand of the same fear he was trying to argue Henri Delacroix out of. Going out there and making the case meant committing to a fight he wasn't sure he could win. It was easier to keep it theoretical until it wasn't. Margaret had said do it soon in a tone that made theoretical feel like a choice, and that had apparently been what he needed. He was gone most of the morning. Margaret found out about the fence while he was away. She was walking the north fence line, something she'd taken to doing on the mornings when Clara napped, because walking helped her think, and the fence helped her walk in a straight line without having to decide which direction to go when she found the section. 2 posts had been pulled entirely, and a 30-foot span of wire dragged away, not cut but pulled, which was deliberate and time-consuming in a way that made it worse. On the other side of the broken line, in the soft ground near the creek, there were hoof prints. Multiple horses. They had been there at night. The prints were oriented toward the house, toward the barn, not toward the fence, which meant whoever had come had stood in the dark and looked at the lit windows for a while before doing the damage. She stood and looked at the gap in the fence and the hoof prints and felt something in her chest go cold and solid, the way water goes when it freezes. It didn't stop, it just changed state. She did not go back to the house and wait. She counted the posts that would need replacing. She paced the distance of wire that was missing. She looked at the ground around the prints carefully, because she had grown up with a father who tracked deer and had learned without meaning to how to read what feet told you. There had been 4 horses. They had come from the south. One of them had a front left shoe that needed resetting. The print was slightly uneven in a specific way, a way that would be consistent every time that horse set that foot down. She went back to the house and wrote it all down while Clara slept. Ethan came back in the early afternoon looking like a man who had done something harder than he'd expected. He'd gotten Delacroix to agree to a meeting. That was something. But Delacroix had been further gone with fear than he'd hoped, and talking a frightened man back toward his own courage was slow work that left you tired in a way that wasn't quite physical. Margaret handed him the paper with the fence description. He read it. His face went careful. "You measured the gap?" he said. "I paced it, 30 feet, more or less. 2 posts fully removed, not just knocked loose. They came from the south, 4 horses, probably between midnight and 3 in the morning, based on how the dew had settled around the edges of the prints." She paused. "One horse has a loose shoe on the front left. The print's distinctive." He looked up from the paper. "How do you know about tracks?" "My father hunted. I followed him." She met his eyes. "This isn't my first fence line." He looked at the paper for another moment. "I'll need to repair the fence." "I know, but write down what I wrote down, somewhere better than that paper. Date it. Keep it somewhere." She thought about what he'd said about things that can't be proved. You need to start building proof while there's still proof to build. I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did you eat anything while I was gone?" She blinked. It was such a left turn from what they'd been discussing that for a second she couldn't track it. Yes, at noon." You look like you didn't," he said, and went to the stove. She sat down at the table because her legs, she discovered, were slightly unsteady, which meant the thing in her chest that had gone cold and solid at the fence line had been costing her more than she'd noticed. She sat down and watched Ethan Walker heat up the leftover beans from the day before with the careful attention of a man who cooked for survival rather than pleasure, and she thought, "I have been here 5 weeks, and I am in the middle of someone else's fight, and I came here with $9 and a dead woman's baby, and I am making notes about hoof prints." She thought, "This is not what I expected." She thought, "I am not afraid of it." That last thought surprised her enough that she sat with it for a while to see if it was true. It appeared to be. She was concerned, she was careful, she was very clear-eyed about the fact that things were moving toward a confrontation that nobody in this valley was fully ready for. But she was not afraid. She had spent years being afraid. Of poverty, of dependence, of being the person nobody came for. And she had discovered, here in this kitchen, in this house she hadn't expected to be in, that actual danger felt different from the fear of it. Actual danger was a problem. Problems had components. Components could be worked with. Ethan put a plate in front of her and sat down across the table. "Henri Delacroix is coming to the ranch on Friday," he said. "I was thinking I'd try to get the Harmons too." "More than 3 families is a public meeting," she said. "Someone will talk." "I know, but if it's just 3 households, Thornton will hear it as 3 people who need to be individually pressured instead of a group making a decision." "Then you need more than 3. Enough that pressuring individuals gets expensive." She thought about it. "Who else in this valley is Thornton pushing on?" "Probably 4 other families I know of, maybe more." "Then invite them all." He looked at her across the table. "A meeting that size, someone will definitely talk." "Yes," she said. "So you need to have something to say before that happens. Something specific. Not just we're worried about Thornton. something with numbers, with what's actually happened, documented, to multiple families. Something that makes the meeting sound less like fear and more like strategy. He was quiet for a long moment. "You're describing a lot of work." "Yes," she said. "I am." He ate in silence for a minute. Then, "Would you help?" She had been wondering when he was going to ask. She'd been wondering what she was going to say. "Yes," she said, "but not as your housekeeper." He looked up. "As someone with an actual stake in it," she said. "I'm here. Whatever happens to this ranch affects me and Clara. So I'm not helping because I'm grateful for the room. I'm helping because it matters." Something moved behind his eyes. Something complicated that had several parts to it. He nodded once, slowly. "All right," he said. "That's fair." The Harmon meeting happened on Thursday, 2 days before the larger gathering, because Ethan had decided, and Margaret agreed, that going in with at least one family already committed would change the quality of the room. Eleanor Harmon arrived with her husband and arrived, as Margaret suspected she would, as the more prepared of the two. She was a compact woman in her late 40s with gray threading through brown hair and eyes that moved quickly and settled on things, the way the eyes of someone used to assessing situations did. She looked at Margaret the way Dora Kinsey had looked at her, not unfriendly, but measuring, and then apparently made a decision because her greeting shifted from polite to direct in the space of about 30 seconds. "You're the woman Anderson left behind," she said. "Yes," Margaret said. "Anderson was a coward," Eleanor said, without particular heat, as a statement of fact. "Thornton knew how to find them. He's good at that." She looked around the kitchen. "You've cleaned this place up. Ethan's been fighting that losing battle on his own for too long." She also documented the fence incident, Ethan said from the doorway. Measurements, hoof prints, timing estimate. Eleanor turned and looked at Margaret with the particular expression of a person upgrading their initial assessment. "Did you?" "My father was a tracker," Margaret said. "Mine was a lawyer," Eleanor said. "I'll tell you right now, documentation is the first thing you need and the last thing anyone thinks about until it's too late." She sat down at the table as if she'd been coming to this kitchen for years. "All right, tell me what you have so far." George Harmon, who had the look of a man who had learned long ago that his wife was going to get to the point faster than him and had made peace with it, sat beside her and nodded at intervals and offered specific factual details when Eleanor's account got broad. They had lost 2 calves in the spring to what looked like a cut fence. They had received a letter from an attorney in Tucson, retained by Thornton, though not named in the letter, suggesting that their eastern water access might be legally challenged. George had thrown the letter away. Eleanor had retrieved it from the fire, singed at one corner, and kept it. "I knew we'd need it later," she said, and produced it from her coat pocket, still folded. Ethan looked at the letter. Then he looked at Margaret. She could see the calculation happening. What this meant, how it fit, what it changed. "He started the legal approach," he said. "Started it a while ago," Eleanor said. "That letter's from February." "He wanted to see if the offers were going to work before he spent money on lawyers," Margaret said. "They didn't work. So now he moves to the legal angle at the same time as the intimidation." She thought about Thornton on his gray horse in the yard, the patience in how he'd moved, the sense of a man who had done this before and knew which sequence worked. "He's not improvising. He's running a process." "Then we need to be further ahead in the process than he thinks we are," Eleanor said, and for the first time since the gray horse had appeared in the yard, Margaret felt something that wasn't cold or tight or cautious. It was not relief exactly, more like recognition, like finding out that the people you were going to have to stand with were actually worth standing with. Friday's gathering was supposed to be 7 families. 9 showed up. The 2 extra were the Pratt claim, a young couple, early 20s, who had heard from the Harmons and driven 2 hours to be there, and a man named August Fowler, who was 40 years of Copper Creek and had been ranching in this valley since before Thornton arrived and had watched the whole progression with a slow-burning anger he'd been looking for someone to hand to. Ethan's barn, which was the only space big enough, had 12 adults in it, and the particular taut energy of people who had been afraid separately and were now being afraid together, which felt different. Not better, necessarily. More real. Margaret had spent 2 days preparing. She had a written account of the fence incident with dates and measurements. She had the Harmon singed letter. She had a rough map of the valley that she'd drawn from Ethan's descriptions, showing which land Thornton already owned and which he was targeting, so people could see the pattern instead of just feeling it individually. She had a list of every incident she'd been able to document from the families she'd spoken to in the 2 days before the meeting: cut fences, intimidation visits, legal threats, one fire, 2 missing cattle, a water trough that had been poisoned on the Pratt claim that the Pratts had been afraid to report. She hadn't planned to be the one presenting. That had been Ethan's job. But when the meeting started and she saw the shape of it, 9 families, each holding their own version of the same fear, each waiting to see if anyone else was going to commit first, she understood that what was needed wasn't the rancher they all knew. It was someone they hadn't already decided how to feel about. Someone who didn't have a history with them that could be used to predict what she'd do. Someone, in other words, who was new. She looked at Ethan. He looked at her. Some negotiation happened in that look that didn't require words. She stood up. "I've been in this valley 6 weeks," she said, and felt the room shift its attention to her. Suspicious, curious, uncertain. "I came here because a man named Peter Anderson promised me a life here, and by the time I arrived, Caleb Thornton had already taken it from him. I'm not telling you that to ask for sympathy. I'm telling you because I came to this situation without the history you all have with it, and what I saw from the outside was a pattern." She put the map on the workbench where people could see it. "Look at what he owns. Look at what he's working on. This isn't 7 separate problems. It's one problem with 7 addresses." August Fowler leaned forward and looked at the map. His expression was the expression of a man seeing something confirmed that he'd felt in his gut for 3 years. "The water," he said. "The water," she agreed. "Everything else is noise. The water is what this is about." She talked for 20 minutes. Not eloquently. She stumbled twice, backed up once, and corrected herself, got pulled off track by a question from George Harmon about the specific legal letter and had to find it in her papers. It was not a polished performance. She thought that was probably the right thing. Polished would have made them trust her less. When she was done, the barn was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet at the start. At the start, it had been the quiet of people waiting. Now it was the quiet of people thinking. "So what do we do?" the young man from the Pratt claim said. He had the voice of someone who has been afraid for a while and is ready to do something about it, and just needs to know what. "First," Ethan said, "we stop pretending to Thornton that each of us is making decisions alone." "He'll push back," Henri Delacroix said. He had come, which had been the victory of the week, but he was still sitting slightly apart from the others, still halfway to the door in his posture. "When he finds out we've met." "He'll find out by Monday," Eleanor Harmon said flatly. "Someone in this room will mention it to someone else. That's not a judgment, that's just how things spread." "So we need to be ready," Margaret said. "When he comes back with more pressure, we need to already have the next step planned, not reactive, ahead of him." "And what is the next step?" August Fowler asked. She looked at Ethan. He looked at her. It was becoming a habit, that particular exchange. "A lawyer," she said. "A real one. Not the one Thornton has in Tucson, and not someone who can be bought. Someone we pay ourselves, together, which means the cost isn't impossible and the loyalty is clear." "I know someone in Phoenix," Eleanor said immediately, which meant she'd been thinking about this longer than anyone had realized. The meeting went on for another hour. People argued about costs, about risk, about who would be the most exposed if Thornton retaliated first. Henri Delacroix didn't say much, but he stopped sitting with one foot toward the door, and Margaret thought that was its own kind of progress. Nothing was resolved exactly. That wasn't what the meeting had been for. What it had been for was for 9 families to sit in the same barn and feel the difference between being afraid alone and being afraid together, and to discover that the second version had something in it that the first version didn't. Something that looked, if you held the light right, a little bit like the beginning of a plan. Whoa. After everyone had gone, Ethan and Margaret sat in the quiet barn for a while without talking. Clara was asleep in the house, the lantern burned. Outside, the Arizona dark was full of the sounds that it always had. The small movements of the animals, the wind working its way along the fence line, somewhere distant, a coyote saying something to no one in particular. "He's going to hear about this by Monday," Ethan said. Probably Sunday, she said. And he'll come back. Yes. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. I've been on my own in this for a long time, fighting the same thing over and over and just holding position, not gaining anything. I know, she said. What you said in there about the pattern. He looked at the map she'd made, still unrolled on the workbench. I knew it was a pattern. I'd been too close to it. I couldn't find the shape. She thought about standing in the yard that morning 6 weeks ago with a bill of sale in her hand and Clara on her hip and $9 in her bag. About thinking she had come to the wrong place. About the slow understanding that maybe wrong places were just right places that hadn't gotten there yet. Sometimes you need someone who's only been looking at it for 6 weeks, she said. He looked at her in the dim light of the barn. Just looked, the way he sometimes did. Thoughtful, careful, like he was deciding something that had more weight than whatever words it would eventually produce. I'm glad you stayed, he said. It was not a complicated sentence. She thought that was what made it difficult to sit with. Simple, honest things had always cost her more than complicated ones. Me too, she said. Outside, Caleb Thornton's valley lay waiting in the dark, patient as a man who thinks time belongs to him, not knowing that somewhere in a barn 4 miles north, the shape of the fight had changed. Thornton came back on Sunday. Not with a letter, not with lawyers, not with the men he usually sent ahead of himself to test the temperature of a situation. He came himself, alone, on the gray horse, in the early afternoon when the light was at its harshest, and the valley sat stunned under the kind of heat that made everything feel slightly unreal. Margaret heard the hoofbeats from inside the house and knew before she looked out the window who it was. There was a particular rhythm to that horse that she had apparently memorized without deciding to. Ethan was fixing the north fence, the section that had been pulled out, and she could see him in the distance stop and straighten and watch the rider come. She watched his shoulders do something, a settling, the way a man settles himself when he's deciding how to be in a situation before the situation arrives. She picked up Clara and went to the doorway but didn't go outside. She wanted to hear, and she wanted to see, and she didn't want to give Thornton the satisfaction of watching her come running. I heard you had a gathering, Thornton said. He dismounted with the same unhurried ease as before, as if visiting a man's ranch uninvited was a perfectly normal social practice, and he simply couldn't understand why anyone would be bothered by it. People came out to talk, Ethan said. Quite a few people. Thornton walked toward him slowly, hands relaxed at his sides. 8, 9 families? August Fowler, the Harmons, Henri Delacroix, which surprised me, I'll admit. Why did it surprise you? Henri's a practical man. I thought he understood his situation. Thornton stopped a few feet away and looked out at the fence repair, at the fresh posts and the new wire. Someone's been busy. Someone cut my fence. That's a serious accusation. It's an observation, Ethan said. I didn't say who. Thornton smiled with that lower portion of his face that seemed to operate independently of whatever was actually happening behind his eyes. Walker, I want you to hear me clearly on something. What you're doing, pulling these families together, making them feel like there's strength in it. I understand the appeal. I do. But you are not protecting them. You're putting them in the middle of something they were smart enough to stay out of. They're already in it, Ethan said. You put them there. I made them offers. Fair offers. You made them afraid and then offered to buy the fear. That's not the same thing. Thornton was quiet for a moment. The horse shifted its weight and stood still again. The woman, he said. Margaret Ellis. Ethan went very still. She's been through a hard time, Thornton said, and his voice had shifted to something almost sympathetic, which was worse than when it didn't bother. Abandoned, traveling alone with a child that's not even hers. That kind of situation makes people desperate, makes them latch onto the first solid thing they find. I understand it. He paused. But you should be careful about the advice you're taking from someone who has that much reason to need things to go a certain way. She's not advising me, Ethan said, which was not entirely accurate, and they both knew it. She spoke at your meeting, Thornton said. I know exactly what she said and what she showed people. She drew a map. He said it the way you say something that doesn't concern you, but that you want the other person to know, you know. A woman who's been in this valley 6 weeks drawing maps. That's a particular kind of ambition. From the doorway, Margaret felt the specific anger of hearing herself discussed as a problem, not as a person, as a variable in someone else's calculation. "You should go," Ethan said. "I'll go." Thornton turned back to his horse. "But think about what I said, about who's paying the price for this fight when it gets harder." He mounted without hurrying, "And it will get harder." He rode south. Ethan stood at the fence line for a long moment after the horse was out of sight. Margaret watched him from the doorway. Clara was pulling at the fabric of her collar with single-minded determination, completely indifferent to the fact that things were moving towards something that had no clear edge yet. When Ethan came back to the yard, he didn't say anything immediately. He put his tools in the barn. He washed his hands at the pump. He was doing what she'd come to recognize as his version of organizing his thoughts. The physical action standing in for the internal process, the hands busy so the mind could work. "He knows about the map," she said when he came to the porch. "He knows about everything. He has people who talk to him." "Someone at the meeting." "Maybe, or someone one of the families told afterward." He sat down on the porch step and looked at the empty road south. "Doesn't matter how he knows. He knows." She sat beside him, which she didn't usually do. The step was narrow, and it put them closer than they generally arranged to be, but she was tired of standing in doorways watching things happen, and she wanted to be on the same level as the conversation. "He came to warn you about me," she said. "He came to plant a seed," Ethan said, "about your motives, about whether you can be trusted." He picked up a small stone from the ground beside the step and turned it in his fingers. "He's going to do the same with the other families, probably already has." "Can they be planted in? About me?" He was quiet for a moment, which meant he was going to tell her the truth rather than the reassuring version. "Some of them," he said. "August Fowler, no. Eleanor Harmon, no. But some of the others, they don't know you. They met you once, in a barn, and what they know about you is what Thornton's going to tell them. Which is that I'm a desperate woman who needs this situation to turn out well for personal reasons." Roughly. She looked at the road south. "Is that wrong?" He turned to look at her. "I do need this to turn out well," she said. "I do have personal reasons. I'm not pretending otherwise." "Having personal reasons doesn't make your map wrong," he said. "No," she said, "but it gives people permission to ignore it if they're looking for permission." They sat with that for a while. Clara had fallen asleep against Margaret's shoulder with the sudden totality of babies, here and then entirely gone. The afternoon light was coming down at a lower angle now, long and gold across the yard, turning the dust into something almost beautiful. "What does he do next?" she asked. "Pressure the individuals. Try to break the group back into pieces before it becomes something he can't manage." He set down the stone. "And he'll try something concrete. He doesn't leave things to soft pressure for long." "A legal move?" "Maybe. Or something physical that can be blamed on accident." She thought about the fire he'd mentioned from the previous spring, about the deliberate patience of it, the burn that couldn't be proven. "Then we need to move faster than he expects." "I know." "How soon can Eleanor Harmon reach the lawyer in Phoenix?" "She's already written," he said. She didn't wait. Something shifted in Margaret's chest that was, she decided, respect. Plain and uncomplicated. "Good," she said. The week that followed was the strangest Margaret had spent since arriving. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because of the waiting, which had its own particular quality out here. It wasn't the waiting of a city where you were surrounded by other things happening. It was the waiting of open land, where the quiet gave everything more room to become itself. She kept working. The sewing, the cooking, the management of a house that had more going on in it than it had 2 months ago. Because Ethan had started bringing paperwork to the kitchen table in the evenings, the ranch accounts, and the correspondence with the other families. And somehow the kitchen table had become the place where the resistance, such as it was being organized. She was part of it now in a way that had stopped feeling like something she'd decided and started feeling like something that simply was. She also kept watching. Henri Delacroix came by on Tuesday to talk to Ethan about something, and Margaret made coffee and didn't insert herself but listened from the other room while washing dishes, because Henri was the one she was most uncertain about, and she wanted to understand his particular shape of fear. He was a quiet man, 50s, with the bearing of someone who had once been more confident and had had it eroded over time, the way water takes the edges off stone. He talked about Thornton's visit to his claim. Thornton had gone to him directly, 2 days after the barn meeting, which confirmed what they'd suspected. The visit had been friendly, almost warm. Thornton had talked about Henri's son, asked about him, expressed genuine-sounding concern about an old man running a ranch alone. He had not made an offer. He had simply reminded Henri of his solitude. He didn't threaten anything, Henri said. He didn't have to, Ethan said. No, Henri agreed quietly. He didn't. When Henri left, Margaret came back to the kitchen and refilled the coffee and thought about how well Thornton understood people. He knew that Henri's son leaving had been a grief, not just a practical difficulty. He knew which nerve to press and had pressed it with enough gentleness that it didn't feel like a threat. It just felt like another weight on a man who was already carrying too much. He's going to lose Henri, she said. Ethan looked up. I know. Unless someone spends real time with him, not meetings, actual time. She sat down. He needs to feel like the group is something that will actually be there if Thornton comes down hard. Right now he's calculating whether the risk of joining is worth the protection it offers, and he's not convinced. What are you suggesting? Eleanor Harmon should go see him, not George. Eleanor. She thought about the way Henri had talked, the particular deference in how he had addressed Ethan mixed with the edge of embarrassment, a man not wanting to be seen as weak. He'll talk to a woman differently, less to prove. Ethan looked at her for a moment. You figured that out from overhearing one conversation. I figured that out from being a woman for 31 years, she said. It's not complicated. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. And she'd learned to count the almost ones. I'll talk to Eleanor. The letter from the Phoenix lawyer arrived on Thursday. Margaret read it twice before Ethan came in from the barn, not because she doubted herself the first time, but because she wanted to be sure she'd understood it correctly before she said anything about it. The lawyer's name was Thomas Greer, and he had, Eleanor's letter confirmed, dealt with Thornton before. Not directly, but he knew the Tucson firm that Thornton used and understood its methods. He was willing to take the case. His preliminary assessment, enclosed in careful legal language that Margaret translated as she read, was that Thornton's water rights challenge was technically viable, but rested on a disputed interpretation of territorial law that had not been tested in an Arizona court, which meant it could be fought, which also meant fighting it would cost money and time. What the letter said most clearly, reading between its careful lines, was, this is winnable, but not easily and not cheaply. Ethan read it when he came in. He sat at the table and read it twice, the same way she had. We'd need to pool money from all the families, he said. Yes. Not everyone will contribute the same amount. That's going to create tension. Yes. And Thornton's lawyer has been doing this for years. Greer's good, but he's working from a distance. I know. She poured coffee and set it in front of him. It's still the best option we have. It's the only option we have, he corrected, without resentment. Same thing in this situation. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and stared at the letter. She watched him do what she'd come to understand was his real decision-making. The still part, the part that didn't look like anything from the outside, but was where the actual work happened. It wasn't impulsive, which she'd first mistaken for hesitancy, and now understood was something different. He was thorough. He wanted to have turned a thing over completely before he committed to it, because he didn't like uncommitting. The second meeting needs to happen soon, he said, before Thornton makes his next move. This week, she said. Before the weekend. That's fast. He doesn't give people long gaps. He fills them. She'd been watching Thornton's pattern, the way he moved into silences before the other side could fill them. We need to get the families to a decision before he has time to visit each of them individually again. Ethan nodded slowly. I'll ride out tomorrow, talk to everyone personally before we call the meeting. I'll write the letters tonight, she said, for the ones you can't reach in person, something they can hold in their hands and think about. He looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't quite name. It wasn't the way he'd looked at her in the first weeks. That careful, measuring look, the one that was still deciding what she was. This was something past that, something that had settled. You're good at this, he said. She felt the words land differently than a compliment usually landed, because it wasn't delivered as a compliment. It was delivered as an observation, the way he delivered most things, plainly, without decoration. I'm good at problems that have pieces, she said. My whole life has been problems that had too many pieces and not enough time. Turns out that's a skill. Most people don't see it that way. Most people with that kind of life don't have a choice about whether to see it that way, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Clara made a sound from the other room, a small, exploratory noise that was her version of asking whether anyone was paying attention to her. Margaret started to get up, and Ethan was already halfway out of his chair, and they both stopped and looked at each other in the slightly awkward way of two people who had developed overlapping instincts without discussing it. "I'll get her," he said. "You sure?" "Sit," he said. "Drink your coffee." She sat. She drank her coffee. She listened to the sounds from the other room, Ethan's voice, low and unhurried, talking to Clara in that way he had that wasn't baby talk and wasn't adult talk, but was something particular to him that Clara appeared to find entirely satisfactory. Clara's sound shifted from inquiry to amusement. Something had been shown or demonstrated. A sound was being made that Clara found funny, repeated 3 times for her benefit. Margaret sat at the kitchen table in the early evening with her coffee going warm and letters to write and a fight to plan, and listened to that sound from the other room, and felt something that she could not quite name, but that sat in her chest like something placed there carefully, by someone who had thought about where it would fit. She did not let herself think about what it meant. That was not avoidance. It was a practical decision. She had too much to think about, and adding that particular set of thoughts to the pile would make the pile unstable. She had learned, in the years before this, to keep certain things in a separate compartment until she had time and stability enough to look at them honestly. This went in that compartment. She put a notional label on it that said later and went back to writing letters. The second meeting happened on Saturday late afternoon, in the Harmon barn this time, because the Harmon property was more central, and also because Eleanor had suggested it in a way that made it clear she was not entirely asking. 11 families. 2 more than the first meeting, which meant the word had gotten out in a way that hadn't scared people off but drawn them in, which was not nothing. Thomas Greer's letter was read aloud by Eleanor Harmon, who was, it turned out, a better reader aloud than Ethan or anyone else in the room, projecting the legal language with the clarity of someone who had done her share of talking in rooms where she wasn't supposed to be the loudest voice and had done it anyway. After the reading, there was a silence. Then August Fowler said, "What's it going to cost?" Eleanor named a figure. It was not a small figure. There was a particular quality of discomfort in the room that was not quite objection, more like the sound of people running math they didn't like the answer to. "Divided 11 ways," Margaret said, "it's less than 1 month's wages for most operations here." She had done this calculation 2 days ago and had been waiting for the right moment. "It's less than what most of us have already lost to cut fences, missing cattle, and poisoned troughs." She looked at the young couple from the Pratt claim. "You lost 2 calves in May. What did those calves cost you?" The young man, Daniel Pratt, she'd learned his name now, looked at his wife briefly. "More than our share of this," he said. "Everyone in this room has already paid," Margaret said. "We've just been paying Thornton instead of a lawyer." It wasn't a fancy argument, it was an accounting argument, which was the right kind for a room full of people who ran operations and understood numbers better than speeches. She watched it land the way a practical truth lands, not with excitement, but with the quiet click of something recognizing itself. Henri Delacroix, who had come despite everything and was sitting in the second row this time instead of near the door, Eleanor had gone to see him on Wednesday, as Margaret had suggested, and whatever they had talked about had been sufficient, raised his hand. "I'm in," he said. It was 2 words. It broke something open in the room. 5 minutes later, all 11 families had committed. What Margaret hadn't accounted for, in the planning and the letters and the careful construction of the alliance, was how quickly Thornton would understand what had happened and how directly he would decide to respond. She found out 4 days later, on a Wednesday, when she went into Copper Creek for supplies, and found that something had shifted in the town in a way that was different from the earlier shifting. This was not the careful distance of people deciding what to think. This was something that had already been decided. Dora Kinsey pulled her aside in the mercantile, which was not a Dora Kinsey kind of action. Dora did not pull people aside. Dora said things directly in open spaces and let other people do the sideways things. The fact that she was pulling Margaret into the back of the store meant something had gotten serious enough to override her habits. There's a story going around, Dora said, with the expression of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have. About me, Margaret said. It wasn't a question. About you and Walker and about the meetings. The story is that you're the one behind all of it, and the reason you're behind it is that you've convinced Walker to promise you the ranch in exchange for, well, Dora stopped. For what I'm apparently providing, Margaret said flatly. That's the polite version, Dora said. Margaret stood in the back of Dora Kinsey's mercantile and looked at a shelf of dry goods and breathed carefully through her nose. She had known something like this was coming. She had known because it was the logical next move. If you couldn't discredit the argument, you discredited the person making it. She had known it intellectually, the way you can know something is going to hurt before it does. It hurt anyway. Who's spreading it? She asked. Jim Harker, mostly. But it's got the feeling of something that didn't start with Jim Harker. No, Margaret said. It didn't. She bought her supplies. She kept her face arranged correctly. She loaded the wagon outside while Jim Harker watched from the saloon doorway, and she did not look at him, not because she was afraid of him, but because she understood now that he was not the actual problem, and spending her energy on him would be wasting it. On the drive back to the ranch, Clara asleep in her basket behind the seat, Margaret let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly the length of time it took to get from the edge of Copper Creek to the cottonwood stand 2 miles north. Then she stopped feeling it and started thinking about it. Thornton had done this deliberately and had done it well. He had taken the truest thing about her situation, that she needed this to work, that she was bound to Ethan in ways that were hard to explain and easy to misrepresent, and had turned it into a story that made her the problem. If the families believed it, they would stop trusting her contributions. If the community believed it, they would stop trusting Ethan's judgment. 2 birds, 1 well-aimed stone. She came back to the ranch and found Ethan in the barn and told him directly, because telling it indirectly was not something she was willing to do. She said what the story was and where it was coming from and what she thought it was designed to accomplish. And there was a silence that had several kinds of anger in it, and she could see him sorting through them, trying to find the one that was useful. I'll go into town, he said. And say what? I'll make it clear that anyone who repeats that story is going to have a problem with me. That will confirm it, she said. Men don't defend women's honor unless something's there to defend. He stopped. He looked at her. She could see that he knew she was right and didn't like it. Then what do we do? He said, and there was an edge in it. Not at her, but at the situation, at the specific helplessness of having a true thing made into a weapon. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I need to think about it. She thought about it for 2 days. She thought about it while she cooked and mended and wrote correspondence and watched Clara discover the particular joy of banging a wooden spoon against an overturned pot with focused mechanical repetition. She thought about it in the early mornings when she was awake before Ethan in the house had the particular quiet of a place that was still deciding what the day was going to be. The conclusion she reached was uncomfortable, which she had come to understand was usually the sign that it was the right one. She couldn't fight the story by defending herself to the people who were already being told it. That was reactive, and reactive was Thornton's preferred position for his opponents. She couldn't ignore it, because silence in the face of accusation was its own kind of confirmation. She couldn't have Ethan fight it, for the reasons she'd already explained. What she could do was take the ground away from under it, not by defending herself, by being so publicly, plainly, unmistakably herself, her actual self, the one with the history and the hard years and the $9 and the dead sister's baby, that the story Thornton was telling became obviously wrong to anyone who looked at both versions. It meant telling the truth in public before he had time to replace it with something worse. Not a defensive truth, a chosen one. She went to Ethan on the evening of the second day and told him what she was thinking. He listened the way he listened to things that he thought were right, but that cost something. You'd be telling the whole town everything, he said. I'd be telling them the truth on my own terms. That's different from them finding out on his. People will still judge. People are already judging, she said. At least this way I'm the one deciding what they're judging. He was quiet for a long time. The lantern flame moved in a small draft from somewhere, and the shadows shifted on the wall. Clara was asleep. Outside, the night was doing what it did, big and dark and indifferent, which was either terrifying or clarifying depending on what you brought to it. It's a risk, he said finally. Everything we've done has been a risk. This is a different kind. This one's on you personally. I know, she said. I know exactly what it is. He looked at her. Are you sure? She thought about the bill of sale she'd held on the main street of Copper Creek on a Tuesday, the sun coming down like judgment, Clara on her hip and $9 in her bag. She thought about what it had felt like to stand there, and what it had felt like to stop being afraid and get angry instead. She thought about the map she'd drawn and the letters she'd written and the 2 days of careful preparation for the Saturday meeting and Henri Delacroix sitting in the second row instead of near the door. She thought about what it meant to have something worth fighting for, and the specific difference between that and having something you were just afraid of losing. Yes, she said, I'm sure. What she didn't say, because the time for it hadn't arrived yet, she was sure in the way you're sure about a thing when you've stopped making the decision and the decision has started making itself. When you have been turning a thing over for long enough that one morning you wake up, and it isn't a question anymore. It's simply where you stand. Outside, in the deep dark of the Arizona night, Caleb Thornton was somewhere planning the next move in a game he'd been winning for years. He understood land and money and the specific ways fear worked on people who had something to lose. What he had not fully accounted for was a woman from Missouri with a dead sister's baby and $9, and the particular kind of anger that comes not from being attacked, but from watching an unfair thing happen to people who deserved better. He would find out soon enough. Margaret Ellis was done being the woman a story was told about. She was going to be the one doing the telling. She chose a Saturday. Not because Saturday had any particular significance, but because Saturday was when Copper Creek had the most people in it. The ranching families coming in for supplies, the townspeople doing their weekly business, the kind of natural gathering that didn't require anyone to be called or invited. She would not need to organize an audience. She would only need to stand in front of the one that already existed. She told Ethan on Thursday evening what she was planning to do and where and when, and he listened with the expression he wore when he was controlling his first reaction in order to find out if his second reaction was any better. You're going to stand in the middle of town, he said, outside the Mercantile, Saturday morning, when the most people are there. And say what exactly? The truth, she said, my version of it, before Thornton's version is the only one available. He was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me? She had expected argument. The absence of it moved her more than she wanted to show. Be there, she said. Don't speak unless I ask you to. And don't look like you're protecting me, because that will make it look like I need protecting. That's a complicated set of instructions. Can you follow them? He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to genuine questions. I'll try, he said. That's honest. That's enough, she said. She did not sleep well Thursday night or Friday night, which she had anticipated. She lay in the narrow converted storage room listening to the particular silence of the ranch at night and went over what she was going to say, not word for word. She wasn't a speech maker. She had no prepared text. But in shape and in order. What mattered first? What mattered second? Where she was willing to be vulnerable and where she was not. The line between honesty that opened things up and honesty that simply handed people more ammunition. Clara woke twice Friday night, which was unusual for her at 7 months old, as if she had absorbed some quality of unease from the house. Margaret fed her in the dark and held her longer than necessary and thought about Ruth, about what Ruth would say about all of this. Ruth had been the practical one, but she had not been a coward. She had believed that the truth, stated plainly to the right people at the right time, was one of the few tools that could not be taken from you. Margaret decided that would have to be enough to lean on. Saturday morning came in clear and hot, which was how most mornings came here, and Ethan had the wagon ready before she asked. He drove without talking, which was the right thing. Clara sat in her basket behind the seat, wide awake and interested in the landscape, the way she was always interested in things that moved, which Margaret found, in this moment, almost funny. That there was a 7-month-old child for whom today was simply a wagon ride and the source of several interesting visual phenomena. The main street of Copper Creek was already busy by 9 o'clock. 3 wagons along the rail outside the Mercantile. A group of men outside the hardware store. Women moving between shops with the specific purposeful stride of people with a limited amount of time and a full list of things to accomplish. Margaret climbed down from the wagon. Ethan tied the horse. He did not offer her his hand and she did not ask for it, and that particular unspoken negotiation was, she thought, one of the more honest moments they'd had. She walked to the center of the street in front of Dora Kinsey's mercantile, and she stopped and she said, at a volume that was not a shout but that carried, "I'd like a few minutes of people's time." The street did not stop immediately. It slowed, the way a current slows when something interrupts its channel. People turned. People who had been mid-conversation trailed off. A woman she didn't know paused with her hand on the mercantile door. Jim Harker was leaning against the post outside the saloon, which opened early out here. She had not arranged her position relative to him, but she noted that he was in her sight line and she was in his, which would have to do. "My name is Margaret Ellis," she said. "I came to Copper Creek 9 weeks ago because a man named Peter Anderson wrote to me from a newspaper advertisement and described a ranch and a future and a new beginning. By the time I arrived, he had sold the ranch to Caleb Thornton for less than half its value and left the territory." She paused. Not for effect. She needed the pause. "I had a baby on my hip and $9 in my bag, and no one I knew within 900 miles. The street was quiet now. Not entirely, but nearly. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," she said. "I'm telling you because there is a story going around about why I am at Ethan Walker's ranch and what I am doing there, and that story is a lie, and I'd rather tell you the true version myself than let a lie become common knowledge simply because no one bothered to correct it." She saw Dora Kinsey appear in the doorway of the mercantile, saw Eleanor Harmon, who had driven in this morning and whose presence was not accidental, stop on the far side of the street and stand still. "Ethan Walker offered me a room and work when I had neither," Margaret said. "He did it because it was the right thing to do, and because he is not the kind of man who walks past someone who needs help. In return, I cook and mend and do what any working housekeeper does. I also helped organize 2 meetings of valley ranchers because I have eyes, and I can see what Caleb Thornton is doing to this community, and because it needed doing, and I was there to do it." She looked directly at Jim Harker, who had straightened away from the post. "The story that says otherwise is Thornton's story. It's designed to make you distrust the people who are trying to stop him from taking everything south of the North Ridge. It is not the truth. And I'm standing here in the middle of this street to say so plainly, because that is the only thing I know how to do." Silence. The particular held-breath silence of a crowd that has not yet decided what it thinks. Then August Fowler's voice from somewhere to her left. "How do we know Thornton's behind it?" "You don't," she said, turning toward him. "Not with proof. But you can ask yourself who benefits from people not trusting me, and the answer to that question is not complicated." "Doesn't mean it's not true," someone else said. She couldn't see who. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. But you've met me. You've met Ethan Walker. You know what kind of man he is. Decide based on what you actually know, not on what you've been handed by someone with a reason to hand it." She stopped. Not because she had run out of things to say, but because she had said what she'd come to say. And she had learned somewhere along the way that more words after the right moment was usually damage control for having misjudged the moment. She had not misjudged it. She could feel that the way you feel when a key fits a lock. Not with excitement, just with the quiet rightness of a thing working the way it was supposed to. She walked back to the wagon. She did not look at Ethan. She climbed up and sat down and stared straight ahead. He climbed up beside her and picked up the reins and drove out of Copper Creek at an unhurried pace, and they did not say anything for the full 2 miles back to the cottonwood stand, and then he said, "That was something." "Was it the right something?" she asked. He thought about it, genuinely thought, not reassured. "Yes," he said. "I think so." "You think?" "I'm certain it was honest. Whether honest was the right play, we'll know in a few days." He glanced at her. "You shook Jim Harker. He didn't know what to do with you." "Jim Harker is not the problem." "No, but he's the mouth. You closed the mouth." She looked at the road ahead. Her hands in her lap were steadier than she felt entitled to. "I keep thinking about what Thornton's going to do with it," she said. "He's going to do something with it," Ethan agreed. "He doesn't let things go unanswered." "I know." They drove the rest of the way in silence that was not empty, and when they got back to the ranch, Clara woke up and immediately began commenting on things at volume, which broke the held quality of the morning into something more ordinary, and Margaret was grateful for it. Thornton's answer came faster than either of them expected. It came on Monday, in the form of 2 men she hadn't seen before, not Jim Harker's type, not rough-edged saloon idlers. These were men in decent clothes who arrived at the ranch mid-morning with a document, an official-looking document with a seal at the bottom, which one of them handed to Ethan with the polite efficiency of people who were being paid to deliver something rather than to discuss it. The document was a legal claim. It asserted that the water rights to the creek running through Ethan's property had been legally transferred. Through a chain of transactions that Margaret could see, reading over Ethan's shoulder, had been constructed with considerable care to a land company registered in Tucson. The land company, the document noted, was prepared to negotiate access agreements with neighboring ranchers for a fee. The men left without discussion, having apparently been instructed not to engage in any. Ethan stood in the yard holding the document, and Margaret watched his face go through something that took a while and had several stages. The first stage was a kind of blank stillness. The second was something harder. The third was the particular set of his jaw that she had learned to recognize as him, deciding not to be afraid of a thing. "He's been building this for a while," she said. "Years, probably." He read through it again. "The chain of transactions goes back 4 years. He knew he was going to make this move eventually. He was waiting until he had the other pieces in place." She took the document from him and read it more carefully. "The land company. It's real, registered properly. Greer needs to see this today. Greer's in Phoenix. Telegraph him." He looked at the document in her hands. "If this holds up." "If it holds up, every rancher downstream of your creek pays Thornton for water access on his terms." She handed the document back. "This isn't just about your ranch anymore. This is the move he's been working toward." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I need to ride to the Harmons." "I'll draft the telegraph to Greer," she said, "and I'll send word to the other families. They need to know this is happening before they hear it from Thornton's men." He was already moving toward the barn. Then he stopped. He turned back, and he looked at her in a way that was different from the way he'd looked at her before. Not the calculating look of the early weeks. Not the settled look of more recent days, something more direct than either. "Margaret?" She waited. "After this is over," he said, and then stopped, and she could see him deciding something about the timing of it and deciding against it. "Never mind. We'll talk later." "All right," she said. She watched him saddle his horse and ride north. Then she went inside and wrote the most important telegraph message she had ever written, which she kept to 37 words because the telegraph office charged by the word, and 37 was enough if you chose them right. The next 4 days had the quality of a drawn breath. Greer's response came in 2 parts. A short telegraph on Tuesday that said the chain of title would require careful examination and that he was leaving Phoenix on Wednesday, and a longer letter that arrived Thursday by fast rider. Greer had apparently hired a rider to beat the post, that laid out, in language she had to read carefully but could follow, the specific weakness in Thornton's claim. The water rights transfer, Greer explained, rested on a transaction from 3 years prior in which a man named Silas Cruz had sold his parcel, which included a small tributary that fed into the main creek, to Thornton's land company. The problem was that Silas Cruz had not owned the water rights independently. They had been held in common with 3 neighboring properties under an arrangement registered with the Territorial Land Office in 1879. A common arrangement, Greer noted that Thornton's lawyers had apparently hoped no one would bother to look up. Someone had bothered to look it up. That someone was Thomas Greer, within 18 hours of receiving Margaret's telegraph. "He overreached," Eleanor Harmon said on Friday morning, when Margaret read the relevant portion of Greer's letter to the group assembled in the Walker kitchen. Ethan, Eleanor, George, Henri Delacroix, and August Fowler, who had driven 40 minutes to be there. "He thought no one would check the original registration." "He thought we wouldn't have a lawyer who knew where to check," Margaret said. "That's different." "Can we fight it?" George Harmon asked. He was looking at Ethan with the particular directness of a man who had made a decision and wanted to confirm it in someone else's face. "Greer thinks so," Ethan said. "The common arrangement means Thornton's transfer is legally incomplete. He acquired one piece of a shared right, which doesn't give him the whole right." "But he can still claim it in court," Henri said. He was not near the door this time. He had taken a chair in the middle of the room, and his hands were on his knees, and he was engaged in a way he hadn't been before. "It will still cost money and time." "Yes," Margaret said, "it will." "But the difference," Eleanor said, leaning forward, is that we now have a specific documented flaw in his claim. We're not fighting a vague threat, we're fighting a paperwork error that he can't fix without unwinding 4 years of transactions. The room was quiet for a moment. Quiet in the particular way of people who can see a path and are deciding whether to walk it. August Fowler broke it. "All right," he said. He had the voice of a man who had been waiting to say something simple for a long time. "Let's fight the damn thing." What happened next was less dramatic than Margaret had expected and more exhausting. The law worked slowly. That was simply its nature. Not a flaw, just a feature that favored people with patience and resources, which was why Thornton had always preferred it to more overt methods. Greer filed the counterclaim in Tucson. Thornton's lawyers responded. There was a preliminary hearing set for 6 weeks out, which meant 6 weeks of living with the uncertainty, which Thornton used skillfully. He used it the way he used everything, by filling the gap with pressure. The fence incidents accelerated. The Pratt claim lost 3 head of cattle in a single night, which couldn't be proven but couldn't be coincidental. A water trough on the Delacroix property was contaminated again, same method as before, and this time Henri didn't hesitate. He documented it himself, photographs and written description, and sent copies to Grier by the next post. Margaret noticed that Henri had stopped having the look of a man halfway out the door. He had, somewhere in the last few weeks, crossed over some internal threshold that she recognized because she had crossed a version of it herself. He was afraid, probably still. But the fear was now inside the decision rather than running it. She was tracking everything, the incidents, the dates, the costs, the pattern, building a document that was partly for Grier and partly for herself, a record of what this actually looked like when you wrote it all down in one place. It looked, written down, like a campaign. It had the shape of something organized and patient and systematic, and that shape was more persuasive than any individual incident, because any individual incident could be explained away. The pattern couldn't. She showed it to Ethan one evening in the 3rd week of the 6-week wait, laid out on the kitchen table in the lamplight. 2 pages of incidents with dates and costs, and a rough calculation of the aggregate damage done to the 11 families over the past 3 years. He read through it slowly. He paused. This is what a court needs. This is what a court needs if we can get it admitted as evidence, she said. Grier has to decide how to use it. Have you sent it to him? I wanted you to see it first. He looked up from the papers. Why? Because it's your fight, she said. I've been helping with it, but it's yours. And I don't want to send anything to the lawyer without you knowing what I'm sending. Something moved in his expression. You've been treating it like it's yours, he said. Not in a bad way, in the way of someone who has skin in it. I do have skin in it. I know. He looked at her steadily. Margaret. She recognized the tone. It was the same tone as the yard the week the document arrived. The one that stopped before it got to the thing it was actually trying to say. Ethan, she said, whatever it is, just say it. He was quiet for a moment that lasted a beat too long, the kind of pause that rewrites what comes after it. I don't want you to leave, he said, when this is settled, however it settles. I don't want you to make plans that have you somewhere else. She held very still. That's not... He stopped, looked away, looked back. I'm not doing this right. You're doing it plainly, she said. That's how you do things. Is plain all right? She thought about the room, the narrow bed in the converted storage room that had a window that faced east, the kitchen table that had become the center of something larger than either of them had anticipated. Clara's laugh. She had developed a laugh now, sudden and total, the kind of laugh that made adults look at each other involuntarily. The photograph of a dark-haired woman, somewhere more careful now, visited privately and not hidden, but not worn like a wound anymore. The way he talked to Clara like she was a person worth consulting, the way he'd looked at her in the doorway of the barn after the first meeting and said, I'm glad you stayed. She thought about what it meant to have arrived at something you hadn't expected by a route you would never have chosen. I'm not planning to leave, she said. I haven't been planning to leave for a while. I should have said something sooner. We had other things to manage. Yes, he said. We did. The lamp on the table burned between them, and outside the Arizona night was doing what it did, big and dark and indifferent, and neither of them said anything else for a while because nothing else was immediately necessary. Thornton's final move came not in the form anyone had prepared for. It came as an accusation. A formal complaint was filed with the Territorial Sheriff's Office in Tucson on a Thursday, 5 days before the preliminary hearing. The complaint alleged that Margaret Ellis, in her capacity as an organizer of what the document called an unlawful assembly of settlers, had conspired to file fraudulent counter-documents in the water rights proceeding. Specifically, that the incident log she had compiled and sent to Greer contained fabricated dates and manufactured evidence. The complaint named her specifically. Not Ethan, not Greer, not any of the 11 families. Her. By name, with her history attached. The abandoned mail order arrangement, her lack of legal standing in the territory, her status as a woman with no property and no formal connection to any of the claims being disputed. Ethan found out when the sheriff's deputy arrived at the ranch on Friday morning. She was in the kitchen when she heard the voices in the yard and came to the door to find Ethan talking to a young deputy with the look of someone doing a job he found slightly distasteful. The deputy looked at her. "Margaret Ellis?" "Yes," she said. "I have a notice requiring your appearance in Tucson in conjunction with a formal complaint." He held out the document. He had the decency to look uncomfortable about it. She took it. She read it on the porch while Ethan stood beside her and the deputy waited with his hat in his hands. She felt, reading it, a specific kind of cold that was different from any cold she'd felt before. Not fear. She examined it carefully, and it was not fear. It was the cold of seeing something clearly. Thornton had looked at the board and seen that the legal challenge was losing ground and had found a different angle. He couldn't destroy the evidence she'd compiled, so he was going to destroy her credibility instead. With the complaint filed 5 days before the hearing, there was no time for Greer to respond properly. With her name on a formal accusation, every document she'd produced became suspect. Every family she'd organized would have to weigh whether their association with her was now a liability. He had done the calculation. He had found the weakest point. He had aimed precisely. She handed the document to Ethan. He read it. The same jaw set she'd seen before, harder this time. "He can't prove it," he said, "because it's not true." "He doesn't need to prove it before the hearing," she said. "He just needs it to exist before the hearing. Then we get Greer on the telegraph in the next hour." Yes. She was already thinking about what came next, about how to respond to this specific shape of attack. "And we need to talk to the families today, before they hear about this from someone else, before Thornton's people have a chance to make it into something it isn't." "I'll ride," Ethan said. "We'll both ride," she said. The deputy left. The deputy had been, she suspected, slightly relieved to leave. Margaret stood on the porch of a ranch she had not known existed 11 weeks ago and looked out at the valley that stretched south toward Copper Creek and toward wherever Caleb Thornton was right now, in whatever office, making whatever next calculation. She thought about the drawn map, about the singed letter Eleanor Harmon had pulled from the fire, about Henri Delacroix sitting in the second row of a barn meeting instead of near the door, about 11 families in a room deciding that being afraid together was better than being afraid alone. She thought about a 7-month-old baby who was, right now, in the kitchen behind her, cheerfully dismantling a wooden spoon she'd been given to prevent her from dismantling anything important. She thought about the specific difference between a situation that was very bad and a situation that was over. They were not the same thing. She had spent enough of her life confusing them, and she was done with that particular mistake. "Go saddle the horses," she told Ethan. "Both of them?" "Both of them," she said. "I'll get Clara." The hours that followed were the hardest of the 11 weeks. Harder than the street in Copper Creek with the bill of sale. Harder than the barn meeting. Harder, even, than standing in the middle of town and telling the truth about herself to people who were deciding what to think. They rode to 4 families in a single day. August Fowler first, because he was closest and because Margaret wanted to go to someone she was certain of first, to use that certainty to steady herself for the families she was less sure about. August Fowler read the complaint notice without expression and said, "This is Thornton scared, you understand that?" And she said, "I'm starting to." And he said, "Good." Henri Delacroix next, because Henri was the one she'd worried most about through all of this, and she needed to see his face when he read it. He read it at his kitchen table with the carefully neutral expression of a man managing his reactions. And then he looked up and said, in French-accented English, that got slightly more French when he was emotional. He is doing this because he is losing. Do you believe that? She asked. I believe the legal claim is failing, he said, and I believe a man who thinks he is winning does not file papers against a woman who has no property and no formal standing. He does this because she is the thing holding the other pieces together, and he cannot find another way to remove her. She sat with that for a moment. Are you still in? Madame Ellis, he said, with the particular dignity of someone who has made a decision they intend to keep, I am not a man who pulls his name from a thing the moment it becomes difficult. I had to remember that about myself. But I have remembered it. The Pratt claim, where the young wife Sarah opened the door and read the notice and said simply, What do you need from us? And the Harmon property last, because Eleanor would be the most useful once she knew, and Eleanor would have already thought of 3 things by the time Margaret finished speaking. That was exactly what happened. Eleanor read the notice, set it down, and said, The date discrepancy is going to be their angle. They'll try to prove your incident log contains an entry that predates when you say you observed the incident. Can they? They can claim it. Proving it is harder. Eleanor was already at her writing desk. I'm writing to Greer tonight with specific documentation on the fence incident dates, signed by George and me. Physical corroboration. She looked up. The Pratt cattle loss. Is there anyone else who saw it? Daniel Pratt said his neighbor's hand mentioned seeing riders on the south pasture that night. Get a signed statement from the hand before the end of the week. Margaret looked at Eleanor Harmon and felt the specific relief of being in the presence of someone who responded to problems by immediately identifying what needed to be done. I'll get the statement tomorrow, she said. Good. Eleanor wrote something. Thornton has made a mistake. He thought filing against you would break the group apart. He didn't understand that by that point you were already too far in. She looked up. You'd become necessary. People fight harder for something when it's been attacked directly. I don't want to be the reason they're fighting harder, Margaret said. I want them fighting for their own land. They are, Eleanor said. You're just an additional reason. She said it with the brisk practicality of a woman who gave compliments the same way she gave all information, directly, without decoration, and only when they were accurate. Driving back to the ranch in the late evening, Clara asleep in her basket and the stars coming out over the valley in the particular profusion they had out here. Ethan quiet beside her on the wagon seat, Margaret thought about what Eleanor had said, that she had become necessary, that the attack had misread the situation. She thought about Thornton in his office, patient and practiced, running his process. She thought about how long he had been winning, about the 4 families she knew of who had sold, about Anderson, 40 cents on the dollar, running. She thought, he has never dealt with someone who came here with nothing, and therefore has nothing left to be afraid of losing. She thought, that might be the only advantage I've ever had, and I am going to use every last piece of it. The wagon rolled north through the dark, and above them the sky was enormous. The way it only was out here. The kind of sky that made everything under it feel both very small and very significant at the same time, which was a contradiction that Margaret had stopped trying to resolve because some contradictions were just how things were. We're going to win this, Ethan said. Not a question, not quite. We're going to fight it right, she said. That's all I know for certain. He nodded. That was enough for him. It had to be enough for her, too. 5 days until the hearing. Somewhere in Tucson, Thomas Greer was working by lamplight on the documents that would determine what happened to 11 families in 1 creek and 1 ranch and 2 people who had arrived at something neither of them had planned. In the basket behind the wagon seat, Clara slept through all of it, dreaming whatever 7-month-olds dream, entirely unaware that the valley she was being raised in was still being decided. The morning of the hearing, Margaret woke before the sky had decided what color it was going to be. She lay still for a moment in the narrow bed in the room that had started as a storage space and become, without anyone formally deciding it, hers. The window that faced east showed nothing yet but a dark gray suggestion of something coming. She had slept, which surprised her. Not well, not deeply, but she had slept, which meant some part of her had trusted the day enough to close her eyes before it arrived. Clara was quiet. That was the first gift of the morning. She got up and dressed and went to the kitchen and made coffee, and she stood at the window with the cup and watched the sky do what it did out here, committed to the change fast. No long deliberation, dark, and then suddenly not dark, the color coming in from the east like something that had made up its mind. Ethan appeared in the doorway. He had already been to the barn, she could tell. There was the smell of horse and early morning work on him. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything about the day, because they had said everything available to say about it in the 4 days since the accusation notice arrived. In the telegraphs to Greer and the rides to the families and the careful late-night accounting of what they had and what they needed and whether it was enough. He poured coffee. He sat down. She sat across from him. Greer thinks the common title argument holds, he said. I know. He's less certain about the complaint against you. I know that too. He looked at his coffee. If the complaint sticks, if they use it to exclude your documentation from the proceeding, then we fight with what's left, she said. The Harmon's letter, August Fowler's account, Henri's photographs. Daniel Pratt's neighbor's hand signed a statement. It's less than everything, but it's not nothing. No, he said, it's not nothing. They drank their coffee in the early morning quiet of the ranch, and outside the Arizona day was building itself piece by piece the way it always did, indifferent to what was happening under it. And Margaret thought about something Eleanor Harmon had said on their last visit. The law doesn't care about fairness. It cares about what's documented. She had spent 11 weeks documenting. She was about to find out whether she had documented enough. The territorial courthouse in Tucson was a low adobe building with thick walls that held the cool of the previous night longer than the buildings around it. And that small fact, the relative coolness of the interior when Margaret walked in, was the first thing she registered, because her body had been running warm with something she kept refusing to call fear, and the cool hit it like a correction. Thomas Greer was already there. He was a compact man in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that did not show much but that watched everything, and he had the manner of someone who had been in this building many times and had stopped having feelings about it. He shook Ethan's hand, and then he shook Margaret's hand, which she noticed because not everyone in this territory shook a woman's hand in a professional context. The complaint, he said to her directly, which she appreciated. Thornton's lawyers are going to argue that your incident log was assembled after the fact and backdated. Their specific claim is that one entry, the fence incident, the first one, the one you personally documented, contains measurements that you could not have taken on the date you recorded because a survey done by a Thornton-affiliated engineer shows the fence was in a different position 2 weeks prior. She looked at him steadily. The survey is wrong. I know. Or it was conducted on a different section. He held her gaze. Can you prove where you walked that morning? She thought about it. About the particular morning, about waking up and Clara sleeping, and the habit she had developed of walking the fence line because it gave her something straight to walk along while she thought. I told Ethan I was going when I left, she said. He was in the barn. Greer looked at Ethan. She told me, Ethan said, and she was gone approximately 40 minutes, which matches the time it would take to walk to that section and back. That's corroborating testimony from an interested party, Greer said. It helps, but it doesn't settle it. He paused. Is there anything else? Anyone else who would have seen her? She was quiet for a moment, and then she remembered. The Harmon boy, she said, their youngest. He rides the south boundary every other morning for their cattle check. The fence I was walking is visible from the Harmon south boundary. He would have been out there within the same window. Greer looked at her. How old is the boy? 15, maybe 16. Old enough to testify. He made a note. Can you get him here? She looked at Ethan. Ethan was already thinking about the time. Tucson was 3 hours from the Walker Ranch, 2 hours from the Harmon property. The hearing was at 2 o'clock. If I ride now, Ethan said. Ride now, Greer said. Ethan left. Margaret sat in the cool of the courthouse hallway with Clara in her lap, and Thomas Greer across from her going through his documents, and the morning moved the way mornings moved before things happened. Not slowly, exactly, but with the particular quality of time that knows it is being watched and becomes self-conscious about it. Caleb Thornton arrived at 11:30 with 2 lawyers and the specific bearing of a man who expected the day to confirm what he already knew. He walked through the courthouse door without looking at Margaret, which she understood was a choice rather than an oversight. He knew exactly where she was sitting and had decided that the most useful thing he could do with that knowledge was ignore it. One of his lawyers looked at her, a long, professional look that cataloged and moved on. She looked back with the same quality of attention and let him be the one who looked away first. Henri Delacroix arrived at noon, alone, having driven himself 3 hours in a wagon that had seen better days. He sat beside Margaret in the hallway and did not say much, but his being there said enough. August Fowler arrived 20 minutes later, having apparently decided the previous day that he was coming whether or not he'd been asked, because some things you showed up for, and that was simply how it was. Eleanor Harmon arrived at 12:40 with George and their son William, who was 15 years old and had the red-faced solemnity of a boy who understood that he had been called to do something important and was determined not to make a mess of it. Eleanor squeezed Margaret's shoulder once, briefly, on her way past. Not a soft gesture. Eleanor didn't do soft gestures. It was a firm press that said, "We're here." And then she was talking to Greer in the hallway with the rapid, organized efficiency of a woman transferring critical information to someone who needed it. Ethan arrived at 10 minutes to 2. He had ridden hard, and it showed. He came through the door and found her in the hallway, and the look that passed between them was not a question and answer. It was a confirmation. He had made it. William was there. It was enough. "You all right?" he asked, slightly breathless. "Yes," she said. "You?" "Ask me in 2 hours." The hearing was not what she had imagined, which was its own lesson in how the mind built theaters around events that turned out to be smaller and more procedural than expected. There were no speeches, no dramatic revelations, no moment where the truth arrived like weather. It was documents and arguments and a territorial judge named Carver, who had the manner of a man who had heard every version of every story and was interested only in what could be shown. Greer presented the common title argument first. The 1879 registration that showed the water rights held in common among 4 properties, including what was now the Walker Ranch. The chain of transactions Thornton had constructed, elegant, Greer acknowledged, and carefully built, nonetheless rested on the Silas Cruz parcel, which had never independently held the water rights being transferred. What Thornton had purchased was 1/4 of a shared arrangement, not the arrangement itself. Thornton's lead lawyer, a polished man named Aldred, argued that the 1879 registration had been superseded by subsequent territorial statute. Greer had anticipated this. He had 3 cases from other territories where similar arguments had been tested and failed, which he presented with the particular satisfaction of someone who had done their reading. Judge Carver read the cases. He asked 2 questions. He made notes. Then came the complaint against Margaret. Aldred presented the survey. The fence position discrepancy. The implication, carefully stated and never quite directly made, that an incident log produced by a woman with no formal standing in the territory and a documented interest in the outcome of this proceeding was not the kind of evidence that should carry weight in a legal determination. Greer called William Harmon. The boy stood up with the focused gravity of someone who had been given instructions he intended to follow precisely. He confirmed that he rode the south boundary on alternating mornings for the Harmon cattle check. He confirmed the date in question. He confirmed that he had seen a woman walking the fence line on the Walker north boundary. He knew it was the Walker boundary because he knew where his family's land ended and his neighbors began. She had been carrying something, he thought paper, and she had been walking slowly and looking at the ground. Aldred asked whether he could identify the woman. William looked at Margaret. "Yes," he said. "It's her, Mrs. Ellis." Aldred asked how he could be certain, given the distance. William said, "Because she was carrying a baby on her back in a sling, and I'd seen her before at the Walker place with the same baby, and there is not another woman in this valley who looks like her and carries a baby that way." The room was quiet for a moment. Judge Carver made a note. Greer presented the aggregate incident documentation next. Not Margaret's log alone, but the corroborating accounts from each family, the Harmon's signed statement, Henri Delacroix's photographs, the neighboring hand's account of riders on the Pratt South pasture. He presented it not as proof of Thornton's specific culpability, but as a documented pattern of incidents whose aggregate cost to 11 families across a 3-year period amounted to a number that the judge read twice and then wrote down. He did not accuse. He documented. He let the pattern speak for itself, which was what patterns were for. Judge Carver recessed for 30 minutes. Margaret sat in the hallway with Ethan and Clara and the Harmons and Henri and August Fowler and did not talk much because there was nothing useful left to say, and she had spent 11 weeks saying useful things, and she was, for the moment, finished. Clara pulled at the buttons of her collar. Margaret let her, because at 8 months old, Clara had decided that buttons were one of the primary interesting things in the world, and Margaret had stopped arguing about it. "The boy did well," Eleanor said. "He did," Margaret agreed. "He was scared," Eleanor said, without apology for the fact. "But he told the truth, which is all anyone can do." Ethan was sitting on the bench with his forearms on his knees, looking at the floor in the particular way he looked at things when he was waiting, and had decided not to fill the waiting with anything. She was close enough to him that their shoulders were almost touching, which had become, over the course of 11 weeks, a kind of default. Not a gesture, not a statement, just the proximity of two people who had stopped managing the distance between them. When the 30 minutes were up and Judge Carver returned, the room had the particular held quality of something that has been decided and not yet said. The judge ruled that the 1879 common title registration was valid and had not been superseded by subsequent statute in the specific manner Thornton's claim required. The water rights transfer built on the Silas Cruz parcel alone was legally incomplete. Thornton's land company held 1/4 of a shared arrangement and could not claim exclusive rights or charge access fees on that basis. The complaint against Margaret Ellis was dismissed. The survey evidence, when weighed against corroborating eyewitness testimony and the aggregate pattern documentation, did not support a finding of fraudulent record-keeping. The judge said several more things after that, technical things about filings and remedies and what the parties could expect going forward, but Margaret heard them from a slight distance because she was managing something in her chest that had gotten very full very quickly and needed a moment to redistribute itself. Ethan's hand found hers under the table. Not dramatically, just there. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the judge and felt his hand around hers and breathed carefully and let the moment be what it was. Caleb Thornton left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. His lawyers gathered their documents with the efficient composure of men who were already thinking about the next filing because this was not over. Margaret understood that. A ruling was not a surrender. Thornton had resources and patience and a process, and the process would continue. But the shape of it had changed. He had tried to erase her, and she had not been erased. He had tried to break the group apart, and the group had held. He had tried to use the law as a weapon and found someone who knew how to use it back. None of that guaranteed the future, but it changed what the future could look like, and that was not nothing. August Fowler shook Margaret's hand in the courthouse doorway. "Well," he said, with the compressed satisfaction of a man who did not use more words than necessary. "All right, then." Henri Delacroix embraced her, briefly, with the formality of a man from a different era who has decided that the moment warrants the gesture anyway. "My son is coming back in the spring," he said. "I wrote to him last week. I told him the valley was worth coming back to." She looked at him. "Is it?" "It is now," he said, and walked to his wagon. Eleanor Harmon, predictably, had already moved to practical matters. She was talking to Greer about next steps, the ongoing legal position, what the ruling meant for Thornton's existing agreements with downstream ranchers, what documentation they should continue building. She caught Margaret's eye across the crowd and nodded once, the specific Eleanor Harmon nod that meant this was good work, and also meant now let's figure out what comes next, and also meant don't get comfortable, all in a single gesture. Margaret found, to her own surprise, that she was smiling. They drove back to the ranch in the long, late afternoon light that turned the valley gold, and Clara slept for the first hour, and then woke up and decided the journey required commentary, and she provided it steadily and with great enthusiasm, and Ethan responded to each observation with the patient seriousness he always brought to Clara's communications. And Margaret sat beside him and listened to both of them and felt the specific weight of a day settling. "He'll try again," she said, somewhere past the cottonwood stand. "Probably," Ethan agreed. "Not the same way." "No, he'll find a different angle. And we'll deal with it." "Yes," she said. "We will." It was not a triumphant statement. She had learned enough, in the months since the stagecoach and the bill of sale and the $9, to distrust triumph. It was the thing that made you stop watching, and in country like this, stopping watching was how you got hurt. What she felt instead was something quieter and more durable than triumph, something that did not require the other side to have given up. It was simply the knowledge of what she was capable of, held not as pride but as information. She was capable of this. She had not known that about herself when she arrived. She thought about Ruth, about the particular practicality Ruth would have brought to the past 11 weeks, and how it would have looked almost identical to what Margaret had done, except Ruth would have been less surprised by it. Ruth had always known what Margaret was capable of before Margaret did. That was one of the things she missed most, having someone who saw you clearly and didn't find it remarkable. She thought, I should write that down somewhere, that the people who see you clearly are the ones worth keeping. She thought, Clara is going to need me to tell her that someday. 3 weeks after the hearing, on a Sunday morning when the summer was finally beginning to think about releasing its grip, and the mornings had a slightly different quality to them, a coolness that arrived an hour earlier than it had been arriving, Ethan asked Margaret to marry him. He did it badly, which she appreciated. He had apparently planned something because she could see the evidence of the plan having been set aside. He started twice and stopped himself, and what finally came out was something close to, I would like it very much if you would consider staying permanently, in the formal sense, if that's something you'd be willing to think about. She looked at him across the kitchen table. The formal sense, she said. Marriage, he said. I mean marriage. I'm doing this badly. Yes, she said. He blinked. Yes, you'll consider it, or, yes, Ethan, I'll marry you. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not relief, not excitement, something more fundamental than both. The look of a man whose internal arithmetic had just resolved a calculation he'd been running for a long time. All right, he said. All right, she said. It was not a romantic exchange. It had the feeling of two people who had already been in the middle of something for a long time finally naming what the something was, which was its own kind of romance, if you understood that the naming came after the reality rather than before it. She thought about the letter she had received 9 months ago from a man who had painted her a future in careful words. She thought about how much she had wanted that future and how completely wrong the wanting had been, not because she had wanted the wrong things, but because she had been looking for someone else to hand her a life instead of building one herself. That was the mistake, not the trusting, the waiting for delivery. She had built this, not alone. She would not pretend she had done it alone because Ethan's steadiness and Eleanor's sharpness, and Henri's quiet courage, and William Harmon's honest testimony, and August Fowler's unadorned presence in every room he was needed in had all been part of it. But she had been the one to see the pattern in the map. She had been the one to stand in the middle of the street and say the true thing. She had been the one who arrived with nothing and decided that nothing was a starting point rather than a sentence. Clara took her first steps on a Tuesday in October, which Margaret would later decide was the cruelest detail of all, because Tuesday had always felt like a safe kind of day, and now it had been rewritten twice. She took 3 steps toward Ethan, who was crouched at the far side of the kitchen with his arms out and an expression of absolute concentration. And then she sat down with the sudden decision of someone who has made her point and considers further demonstration unnecessary. Ethan looked up at Margaret. She looked at him. 3 steps, he said. 3 steps, she agreed. Clara examined her own hands with the scholarly attention she brought to things that had recently done something interesting, apparently investigating whether they had been involved in whatever had just happened. Margaret sat down on the floor beside her, which she had started doing because Clara found it more agreeable than being looked at from above, and she looked at this child, her sister's child, her child now in every way that mattered, and thought about the 900 miles and the $9 and the Tuesday in the desert sun with everything gone before she arrived. She thought about what she would tell Clara someday. Not the story. Clara would know the story, or enough of it, but the thing underneath the story, the thing that was true regardless of the specific events. This, that the life you end up with is rarely the life you were heading toward, and that is not always a disaster. Sometimes the map is wrong because the territory hasn't been properly explored yet. Sometimes the thing you were trying to get to was only an approximation of the thing you actually needed, and the route getting there. The stagecoach, and the bill of sale, and the $9, and the man who offered a room when she had nowhere to be, was where the real story happened. This, that courage is not the absence of fear. She had been afraid plenty. She had been afraid of the town that looked at her like a problem to be managed. She had been afraid of the formal complaint with her name on it. She had been afraid, in ways she had not fully admitted at the time, of what it would mean if Thornton won. Not just for the ranch, not just for the families, but for the version of herself that had decided to fight instead of fold. That version was fragile in ways she had not wanted to examine too closely. She had been afraid of finding out that it could be broken. It hadn't been. That was what she knew now that she hadn't known at the beginning. Not that she was unbreakable, she was breakable. She was full of cracks from things that had already happened. But that being breakable and being broken were different things, and she had a choice about which one she was. That chosen family is family. That the people you stand with when things are hardest are yours in a way that blood doesn't guarantee and circumstance can. Ethan was hers. Clara was hers. Eleanor Harmon, in her brisk, unsentimental way, was hers. Henri Delacroix, who was writing to his son about a valley worth returning to. August Fowler with his compressed words and uncompressed loyalty. These people had not been waiting for her. She had not been waiting for them. They had simply found each other in the middle of a fight and discovered that what they were to each other was more than the fight required. That was the part she had not expected. Not the victory. She still wasn't sure that word applied, and she suspected Caleb Thornton was already in some office reconsidering his approach, because men like that did not simply stop. But the people. The specific, imperfect, frustrating, occasionally wrong people who had shown up and held. She had not traveled west to find a husband or a ranch or a new beginning, though she had found versions of all three. She had traveled west running from the feeling that she was not enough. Not enough to build a life with, not enough to be worth fighting for, not enough to make a future out of. That was the real thing she had been carrying when she stepped off the stagecoach with $9 and a dead woman's baby. She had put it down somewhere along the way. She wasn't sure exactly when. Maybe the map. Maybe the fence line. Maybe the moment in the middle of the street when she decided to tell the truth on her own terms instead of waiting for someone else to tell it wrong. Whenever it was down. And she did not intend to pick it back up. That evening, she stood on the porch of the ranch in the cooling air of the first real autumn evening, watching the valley go dark by increments. The light leaving slowly, not all at once, the way light did here, giving you time to look at things before they disappeared. Ethan was inside with Clara, who had decided that the evening was a good time to practice standing next to the kitchen table, gripping the edge and letting go and gripping it again, working out the physics of herself. The valley stretched south toward Copper Creek, and whatever Thornton was planning and the ongoing ordinary difficulty of trying to hold something you'd built in country that was not always friendly to building. The fence line that had been cut and repaired. The creek that was still theirs, for now, because a 15-year-old boy had been riding his family's south boundary on an alternating morning schedule and had seen a woman walking slowly with paper in her hands. The small hinge things, the ones that didn't look like much until you saw what they held. She had been writing about those. Not for anyone in particular, not yet, just for herself. A record of the specific moments that had turned the story. The small choices that hadn't felt like choices at the time. The cup of coffee left on the table. The drawer lined with something soft. The singed letter pulled from a fire. The decision to document instead of complain. The decision to stand in the street. She would write it all down. Maybe it would be useful to someone. Maybe it would only be useful to her. Either way, the writing was the thing. The act of taking what had happened and making it into something you could hold and examine and hand to Clara someday when Clara was old enough to need it. The night came in from the east the way the mornings did, committed and without apology, and Margaret stood in it and let it come. And behind her the kitchen was warm and lit and full of the sounds of a house that had people in it who were hers. And she was not afraid of what tomorrow would bring, which was the best and most honest thing she could say about where she had ended up. Not that it was finished, not that it was safe, that she was ready for it. That, in the end, was enough.